Greetings. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, the All-Wise, True, and Living God, who came in the person of Master Farad Muhammad. I am Sister Alice, your host of The Sure Truth, would like to thank you for tuning in. Today, once again, we're going to be discussing, listening to, and talking about racism and white supremacy in light of current events that are currently going on in the world as we speak. We're going to hear from Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. She was being interviewed by Danny Queen, who is a poet. Queen's Place publishes and promotes the poetic works of Danny Queen. Dr. Welsing was a guest on the show of his that is entitled Color Me Poetry. In her first interview video we're going to be watching, she's talking about the Cress theory, which is based on the work of a thesis that she did, and she's going to be talking about the ISIS papers. Dr. Welsing speaks of her writing in the collections of how she became known as the author of the ISIS papers. Some of it were ideal, taking from the theory of the Cress theory of color confrontation, okay? The other video we're going to watch is the ISIS papers again, and she's telling us that white supremacy and racism is a global system of injustice where people of color are concerned, okay? So based on that, we're gonna have to learn how to play the chess game on the chessboard of racism and white supremacy.
White supremacy. A tribute to Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and Mr. Neely Fuller. As long as white supremacy is alive and well, a white man's heaven is a black man's hell. Uncle Sam and Jim Crow are the arch deceivers of the game, and that old skinhead Ku Klux spirit is still the same. As a man-child of the sun, I've got melanin on my mind. Can't afford to be simply deaf, dumb, and blind when white supremacy is the bottom line. And as long as white supremacy is alive and still kicking ass, freedom, justice, and equality will never come to pass. Many look, but few ever really see. The most unjust dynamic in the world is white supremacy. Hi, I'm Danny Queen, and welcome to another edition of Color Me Poetry. I'd like to welcome my most illustrious guest, the Honorable Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. Welcome,
I'm
Dr.
glad
Welsing.
to be here, Dan.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in your career.
Well, I am a general psychiatrist and child psychiatrist. I'm from Chicago, but I have been in Washington, D.C. since 1958 when I came to medical school at Howard University, and did all of my training in general psychiatry at St. Elizabeth's Hospital and child psychiatry at Children's Hospital here in Washington. And I have been interested. Things didn't start out that way, but I became interested in how to solve the mental health problems and other healthcare problems faced by black people. And I began to realize that until the problem of racism was solved, that black people were going to have difficulty as far as their health collectively, totally, is concerned. And I made up my mind, let me find out about racism.
Now, how many of your colleagues agree with you? How many know what you're saying is true and agree with you?
Well, I don't think I understand your question, but that's not an important consideration. In other words, when you step into new territory, the reason that you have to step into new territory is because other people haven't been there before you. So it would be like asking Einstein, if you will, well, do your colleagues agree with relativity theory? He felt that there was a vacuum in an area of understanding. He moved into the vacuum. Eventually, people caught up to what he had in mind.
As I find that as an artist, sometimes it's like that too, because sometimes, not that you intend to be, but sometimes you have a tendency to be ahead of the pack, if you will.
Well, that you may not, you see, the artist who may step in a new direction doesn't say, I am going to step into a new direction to be ahead of the pack. No, they are inspired or motivated or moved as an individual person to go in one direction, and it then becomes apparent that they are ahead of the pack.
I know, for instance, I did a piece in my book called South Africa some time ago, and at the time when I wrote it, some 10, 12 years ago, it wasn't at the forefront.
Exactly.
And now you see the changes coming about themselves.
Exactly.
But at the time when I wrote that piece, I wasn't thinking, oh, I'm going to be ahead of.
Exactly.
I wasn't even thinking in terms of that at all.
Well, as I move around, whenever I move around the city, and I started writing about racism effectively or thinking about it intensively in 1967 and started talking about it openly from 1970 following my writing about the crest theory of color confrontation and racism, white supremacy. And now, whenever I move about town, I could be in Woody's, I could be at Union Station, I could be on the street. Somebody might come up to me and say, let me shake your hand, or you don't know me, but I started hearing you talk in 1970, and I knew you were crazy. Do you see? But now, 20 years later, I understand what you were talking about. And so that's very interesting to me to have people say that, but it meant that you were talking about something in a manner that was unfamiliar, and people couldn't connect with it. But as the flow of time moves on, do you see, then you become right on time as far as a larger number of people.
So at the time when you were working at Howard, people thought you were very radical and all.
You mean when I was teaching at Howard University? Well, my experience at Howard, because I had gone to medical school there and, knew the people who were on the faculty, and they knew me as a student. I taught there from 1968 to 1975. And people didn't, they considered that I was Francis Cress or Francis Cress Welsing. And I don't feel that they felt generally that I was that radical person. Maybe I became, after other people said, well, she's radical. Okay, then we have to look at this person who we are very familiar with as being this radical
and now
person.
Now it's a lot different, because a lot of things that you had said back then had come to pass.
Well, this is what people say. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Let's talk also about your theory.
The crest theory?
The crest theory.
Well, the crest theory... The crest theory?
The crest theory.
Well, the crest theory is a thesis about racism, white supremacy. And as I was explaining earlier, I got involved in this thinking when I was doing residency in general psychiatry at St. Elizabeth's Hospital and encountering black patients that essentially had been cast to the side. We're not really interested in the black patient. We're interested in other kinds of patients, namely white patients. And I don't think that is uncommon, as we look back on our historic experience, that people were not zeroing in and being interested. One could translate that today when we have a lot of black young people, young male people who are getting into difficulty with drugs and guns. And nobody looks at them and says, I wonder why these children are having these problems. They just lump it in the category of being bad and crime-ridden. Do you see? So that same attitude was what prevailed generally when I began training in psychiatry. And so I started, wait a minute, I'm a third-generation physician in my family. My father was a physician. His father was a physician. And I grew up with the attitude that your responsibility as a physician is to address the medical and health needs of your people like yourself. Not that you would exclude anybody, but your priority responsibility. And so I, started talking to black patients in a psychiatric hospital, and I became impressed by the fact that racism was causing great distress in these lives. The patient wouldn't say, I'm being impacted, doctor, by racism, but they would describe what they had experienced, do you see, and understanding, well, this is a product of racism. So that racism was causing depression, causing drug use, and other kinds of problems that patients face. And so I said, let me understand it. To myself, I have to understand this if I'm going to really be effective as a physician. An effective physician doesn't just, the patient has a cough. The patient is depressed, and write that down in your notes and give some medication. An effective physician, in my viewpoint, is a scientist who will say, what is causing this? Because only when you say, what is the etiology, what is the causation, can you move towards curing the problem, and most importantly, preventing it. from going forward. And so I was looking for this answer, and had the very good fortune of meeting Mr. Neely Fuller, Neely Fuller Jr., who is a citizen of the District of Columbia. And he, on his own, I met him following a Black Power committee meeting. That's back in the 60s, 1967 to be exact. And he was a person attending a meeting who, after I met him, I realized that he had been writing about this topic of racism going back to the Korean War when he was a soldier in the Korean War. And he said on a radar site in Japan, he started thinking about what was happening in the area of the world that we call the United States around the issue of color. And he started putting together his ideas, and when I met him and heard him talk about racism as a global system of power, where persons who classify themselves as white would maintain power over people who they classify as the non-whites, meaning the black, brown, red, and yellow people. And he said the system was operative in all areas of activity: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. And so that just blew my mind. I said, wow, that seems to be a very, very important idea. And after talking with him over a period of time, I started thinking, but why? Do you see? In other words,
why would they do this?
This is a new description of a very critical phenomenon on the planet Earth. I say that racism is the most important phenomenon that anybody can investigate and study. Not for the purpose of putting anyone down, but again, scientifically. This is a critical phenomenon that is impacting the lives of the vast majority of people on this planet in a negative way. And so if we're going to have justice on the planet, so therefore we can have peace, somebody has to probe deeply and understand this problem. And so he had outlined this system. And I guess as a psychiatrist who's always wondering further about the why of behavior, so I thought, well, this seems to describe what I have experienced in my travels in the world, that you don't get away from racism. Racism is everywhere. If you go to Europe, it's there. If you go to Mexico, it's there. What would cause it? And that's how I got into my work, the crest theory, by going, I would say, I don't want to say deeper, but going to another level. Because Mr. Fuller, and this is his book, the textbook for victims of white supremacy.
Dynamic book, I must say.
A most powerful and dynamic book. And so I worked with him from 1967 to 1984 so that we could publish this book. And, that was even something interesting. If somebody said, you work with this gentleman 17 years to make certain that his work is published, I would not have believed it at the time, but I was so impacted by the significance of what he had to say that I said, this has to be published. So we went through a number of twists and turns to bring it about, and it was a trip that took 17 years. But now the book is published, and I consider it to be one of the most important books of the 20th century. And my work just said, well, why would behavior be organized in this way, do you see, with white over non-white, or a tiny minority over the majority people on the planet? And I came up with the paper that's entitled The Crest Theory of Color Confrontation. Crest is my maiden name. I was
Frances Cress Welsing. Dr. Welsing, you were talking about the papers that went in to make the new book.
Papers.
The ISIS papers.
Well, I started with the Crest Theory, as I've said, and then a number of ideas came to me as a result of the Crest Theory. And so I wrote about those various topics, and they ended up being symbolic dimensions of the system of racism or the system of white supremacy.
So once you did the ISIS papers, kind of, as you might say, opened the floodgates for many other ideas on whole nother level.
Right. But I never thought, well, I'm going to do a book. I would write papers and present them to my colleagues in psychiatry at the National Medical Association, which was a black medical association.
What would be their response?
Well, they would find it interesting. Maybe everybody didn't find it interesting. Maybe people said, oh, well, I don't know. I mean, people many times don't come to you with their negative ideas. But many people were interested. And I ended up being one of the people that you'd have large numbers of people coming to, if I was going to present a paper, people would look at the program, and a lot of people would come to hear the presentations. But over time, there were a number of papers, and so Third World Press, Haki Matabuti, encouraged me to, why not put them together in a book? And I was not, because the papers were never written for a large number of people. I thought the ISIS papers or the Crest theory, I thought about 8 colleagues. I'm going to present my ideas about racism to 8 colleagues in psychiatry. And then it turned out a lot of people became interested. And I had no idea that a large number of people would become interested in the essays that evolved from that. But a large number of people have become interested in Third World Press. Published the ISIS papers at the end of 1990.
Now, they published the Crest theory before that.
No, they didn't. I published the Crest theory.
You published. Didn't they publish excerpts from the Institute of Positive Education?
Oh, well,
it's interesting because and that same issue, because I had the magazine. They sent it to me some time ago. But interestingly enough, excerpts from the ISIS paper, from the Crest theory are in there, and I did a poem in the same issue.
Oh, I see. So what year was that?
Oh, I really don't know, but I know.
Isn't that interesting?
And then I meet you years later.
I see.
I did a poem called Ebony Lady.
Okay.
It was in the same issue, and I remember about 2 weeks ago, I was looking at that old issue, looking at something, and I saw an excerpt from the...
Right, that Institute of Positive Education did publish in their Black Books Bulletin.
And I was in the same issue as
some of the papers.
Right.
Okay, and then...
the Crest theory, matter of fact, was in there.
I don't know whether Crest theory was in that or not. I don't think so.
I remember.
Well, okay.
I can bring the issue and show you.
I know certain of the other papers were.
And I found that very interesting.
So that's fascinating that it's coming together.
Yeah, and I was like, oh wow, this is something. And I'll have to get that and show you to you. It's really
that'll be interesting.
Oh, that was like some years ago.
Right. Yeah. We've been at this for a long time.
Yeah, well, you've been doing this more than 20 years.
Yes, that's right.
So the popularity of the papers, of the first paper, which is the ISIS paper,
the Crest theory.
The Crest theory.
A lot of people became interested in that.
Develop a following?
Well, I'm not looking for a following. I'm trying to help people understand a phenomenon that has caused great distress and great pain, and if we understand it, we can change it. So I wasn't interested in a following per se, but a lot of people have told me that the Crest theory changed their lives, and the people who have read the ISIS papers. I can't go anyplace, can't get on a plane. Maybe the stewardess will come up, aren't you the lady who wrote the Crest theory or the ISIS papers or something?
How does that make you feel?
Well, I'm always surprised. Because it wasn't, if I were an artist or, a pop star or something like that, then I would be trying to impact or have people, Dr. Wilson, but that was not where the ideas came from. So I'm always impressed. Oh, people do understand. Or somebody does understand. Because again, my point and my priority is that if there is a problem on the planet, then responsible people will say we must help solve this problem for the well-being of the majority people on the planet, so that everybody can live at the highest level of being humane or being human beings. I mean, that is the objective. At this point in time, we have the mass obscenity of death and dying and starvation and war and murder. I mean, I consider that to be a great, 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 great obscenity. And we cannot say that we respect human life, or we cannot say that we respect the planet, and having human beings killed and destroyed at this level. So I believe that a group of people will come forward, individual people who will participate in solving this problem People like yourself, you're writing all the time about problems and trying to impact the thinking of people. And I don't think this is for naught. I think that, things take time. It takes time for a baby to be born.
It's true.
And it will take time for ideas to change or for you to reach a critical mass of people who have new thinking. Do you see, the new thinking being planetary justice and planetary peace? And so I hope that the things that I've written will, participate in achieving that objective.
I've shared your book with many friends, and the friends have said to me, well, this is too heavy. I can't read it all at one time. I have to read a little bit at a time and then come back. But I think it takes a while for some people to adjust to it because they haven't found people.
See, it's a new way of thinking.
A whole new way.
It's a completely new way of thinking about a problem. So it takes time, but I am impacted. I'm invited to speak on college campuses and at universities as well as other places. But it moves me almost to tears when, I'm not a person that is breaking down and crying, but when somebody says, well, young black people are not reading. But when
and friends have said to me, well, this is too heavy. I can't read it all at one time. I have to read a little bit at a time and then come back. But I think it takes a while for some people to adjust to it because they haven't found people.
See, it's a new way of thinking.
A whole new way.
It's a completely new way of thinking about a problem. So it takes time, but I am impacted. I'm invited to speak on college campuses and at universities as well as other places. But it moves me almost to tears when I'm not a person that is breaking down and crying, but when somebody says, well, young black people are not reading. But when these students come to me, Dr. Wilson, will you autograph my book? And I see a book that has been used up.
Like this one here.
You see, like you were right, Danny. That's wonderful. That's marvelous. That is a book that has been read and digested, and not necessarily doesn't mean that the reader is agreeing with everything, but people are reading the book and thinking, and this is marvelous. Any book. Do you see anything that is inspiring young people to read and to think about their lives and think about the world in which they live and think about the universe. And so they get into it and turning the pages back and underlining in yellow and
like
it's almost falling apart. And Dr. Welsing, I had to buy a second copy. Somebody took my first one. Well, I'm not, I cannot condone that. Right, exactly.
Yeah, because I'm learning when I do that. That's a carryover from school, though.
You see, because I've been a teacher, and my mother was a Chicago public school teacher,
okay.
So the whole idea about learning and reading, do you see, and wanting people to read and wanting people to think and digest ideas and to toss ideas back and forth.
Reading is very important.
Reading.
How well I know
reading.
it.
Right. Okay.
As an English major, I know that reading is very important. You suggest that we read at least
all
3
the
newspapers.
time. Read 3 newspapers a day, so that you become surrounded by the ideas that are flowing in the culture. And also reading, traveling it's been very interesting to me. If you travel to Ohio, you pick up newspapers in the airport, and what are the people thinking? And how do the people think about problems in this particular area? That is also been very important.
Also, I'd like to mention someone of Mr. Neely Fuller's caliber. He's a gentleman. He don't have a degree in anything except common sense. But the society looks down on people who are not degreed, who don't have letters.
Well, sometimes people might. Do you see? Well, where did you go to school, or where did you graduate? Brain computers that have the ability to think.
Malcolm X.
Well, there are thousands, millions of people
that you could
that are manifestations of this. So I just tell people, I think that in the particular societal structure that we have, that a person who wants to maximize their opportunities will take themselves through the steps of getting credentials so that no one will say, well, you don't have this, and so therefore you cannot do. But it doesn't mean that those persons who have those credentials are the only people who have the ability to think. I consider Neely Fuller to be one of the geniuses of our time. Now, he's a very modest person. He will object to my saying that and giving any kind of laudatory praise, because he says the problem that he is addressing, the problem of racism, white supremacy, has not been solved. And so none of us can really stand up for praise. We are people who are working on a problem, and we will see whether or not the ideas have great value if we are able to alter.
If I can quote a line from Mr. Ford, he says, if you don't understand white supremacy, racism, what it is and how it works, everything that you understand will only serve to confuse you.
I agree with that. Do you see? Because it's like a person who steps out on a football field and they think they want to participate in the action, but they don't understand the game. So they'll be confused
So you must understand
by what is happening. In the same way, unless we take our understanding of racism, white supremacy to a greater depth, we will not be able to score, meaning to bring about those changes that we would like to see take place.
Dr. Watson, for people who are interested in your books and lectures, where can we get your books?
Well, I think that Pyramid Bookstore has carried the book, but I'm not involved in the marketing end of it at all. That's something that I...
Is there a number or an address where we could write you?
Well, I'm in the D.C. phone book, but don't write to me asking me for the book. You see, Third World Press in Chicago is where the book was published, and they probably could give the information about all the bookstores that they ship books to in the United States. Now their number is 202-651-0700. That's Third World Press in Chicago, Illinois. But Pyramid Bookstores in Maryland and the District of Columbia have also been selling the book.
It's been great having you here on Color Me Poetry, and certainly wish you the very best. The book has done very well, and we wish continued success with the book. The book has been very well received. I know people coming to me and say, "Man, have you read that ISIS papers?" I said, "Yeah, I read it, man." That's why my copy looks so rough.
Oh, well, I'm glad to see that.
Because I've shared it with many other people. It's good to see other people share their work with other people, and I think that raising the consciousness of our people.
Right.
So it's certainly been great having you here. We're looking forward to having you back. This is Danny Queens, Color Me Poetry, and until next time, Color Me Poetry.